folks, welcome back to the Frontier Western Heritage Channel. I'm Todd Kessner here in Bozeman, Montana. And this time around we're going to do something a little bit different and take a look at some information that might cause you to think that maybe Custer took his own life at the Little Bighorn. Well, what really got me looking at this scenario that could have happened at the Little Bighorn was when I received a package in the mail from friends from Vermont, and honestly, the same friends that got a hold of and provided me with that antique powder, if you watch the Sharps video. And our friend Lisa was helping her Aunt Barbara tidy up the house, clean up the house, and they ran across several magazines of Montana history in Aunt Barbara's house there in Vermont. And they were throwing things out and cleaning it up, and Aunt Barbara said, well, don't you have a friend in Montana? Maybe he'd be interested in receiving some of the old Montana magazines. So they sent them to me, and when I opened up the package that came in the mail, I had several issues, but this one in particular, and this is the winter 1959 issue of Montana, the magazine of Western history. And all of them had really kind of fun stories to read, particularly written in the 1950s. This one caught my eye in particular because when I get back to the section here where the readers will write into the magazine, there was this couple of columns entitled, "Did Custer Commit Suicide?" And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, and so I was reading these pretty thoroughly anyway, but I read through this and really appreciated getting this information from 1959, and just started thinking about this a little bit. So a gentleman wrote in by the name of Bigelow Neal, and when Bigelow Neal was young, he had met a Dr. Porter, and Bigelow Neal is a reader, also a historian and a writer, and apparently is held in relatively high esteem by the editorial crew of the Montana Magazine for Western History, or he wouldn't have his article and his thoughts would not have gotten into the magazine. It's a pretty highly juried magazine, so I kind of take Bigelow Neal's character, I guess, for granted because he's in the magazine. But he wrote in and he said that he really appreciated that the Porter letters had been in an earlier issue. So this Dr. Porter had written letters and they've been published in the Montana Magazine of Western History. And Bigelow Neal from Sanish, North Dakota was expressing his appreciation for that. But went on to say that a lot of those letters had details on the hardships and the loneliness and things that happened as Dr. Porter worked as a surgeon for the Army in the Apache Wars in Arizona in the early 1870s. And then he eventually settled in Bismarck, North Dakota, and became a family practitioner doctor at that time. And he actually brought this Mr. Neal into the world as the doctor proceeding over the birth, and also Mr. Neal's brother. So he's a close family friend. So Bigelow Neal writes, Dr. Porter was visiting us when I was about 14 years old. And I was detailed to take him down with the team and drive him down to the Missouri River to catch a boat so that he could go wherever he was going after that, does not say. But as he was sitting there in the wagon with his team waiting for the boat, so we had to wait about an hour, and sitting on the riverbank, Dr. Porter began as follows. I'm going to tell you a story because I think people should know about it someday. But you understand you are not to tell this to anybody until you know that Mrs. Custer is dead. The winter before we left on the Little Bighorn expedition, the Colt's Firearms Company brought out a new type of revolver, a .41 caliber. They sent 3 of these revolvers to General Terry at Fort Abraham Lincoln, asking that he try them out and give them a report on the weapon. General Terry kept one, gave one to Colonel Custer, and gave the 3rd one to me, being Dr. Porter. All 3 of us were carrying these guns on the day of the battle. The morning we were relieved by General Gibbons, I went with a party to the Custer battlefield, located the body of General Custer. I found that he had been shot twice, one wound high in the shoulder, and unless it became infected, it would not be fatal. The other bullet hole in the temple. Noticing a bunch on the back of Custer's head, I opened it up with my knife and took out the bullet. The bullet was of a curious pointed type, only used in the .41 caliber at that time. And the base of the bullet fit perfectly into the end of my muzzle. This is Dr. Porter's testing his gun. Knowing that Custer shot himself, I reasoned that he was alive at the time when escape was obviously hopeless, and he did what most any man would have done in his place. So Mr. Neal is now writing in this reader's right to the editor. 2 years ago, I wrote the Colt people to see if I could verify the story, and they told me at the time that the revolvers were sent out, and that was undoubtedly right, but they had no record of sending them or who they sent them to in particular. Nor did they have any reports from those which might have been sent to General Custer. However, Mr. Neal says, I know that Dr. Porter told only the truth. This story should be a useful part of history. So as I read this and thought about it, 3 questions came to mind. One is, who is Dr. Porter and how was he involved at the Battle of Little Bighorn? Secondly, was there a firearm that came out from Colt that would fit this description and would have been likely have been tested at the time? And then I also thought, you know, how common is it, or was it common at all, that soldiers would commit suicide rather than be captured by the Sioux and Cheyenne or any other tribe during the Indian Wars? So let's take a look at that information and see what you think. So as I began to question who was Dr. Porter and what he might have to do with the Battle of Little Bighorn, I actually found quite a bit of information on the Little Bighorn website by the National Park Service. And Dr. Porter's got a very, very credible past. And so as I was looking at him, I found this information. Dr. Porter served General Crook in his Apache campaigns in Arizona from September of 1872 to April of 1873. General Crook, at the time, cited Porter for conspicuous gallantry in the closing campaign against the Tonto Apaches in February and March in 1873. So he's very well thought of by General Crook. Porter was a doctor, otherwise known as a surgeon, who contracted periodically with the Army, but he was not a soldier. And so in May of 1876, he entered into a 3-month contract for the Sioux campaign at the age of 28 years old. And as they were heading towards the Little Bighorn, Custer approached Porter and asked him if he would go with his battalion, as he was in better health, Porter was, than Dr. Lord, who was attached to Custer's battalion. But when Dr. Lord was approached, he only said that he would go with the headquarters battalion. And so this change of the Custer's request and then Dr. Lord saying, no, I'm going with you, actually saved Porter's life. So Dr. Porter was the sole surviving surgeon with Custer's 7th Cavalry by the time this thing was over. Surgeon James DeWolf was killed in the retreat from the valley floor, and Surgeon George Lord had gone with Custer and perished with him. So after Reno attacked and then retreated into a wooded area and eventually retreated across the river and up to higher ground in an area that would become known as Reno's Hill. And so for the good part of 2 days, Dr. Porter was the only trained medical professional caring for what would eventually grow to be about 30 wounded men. He established a field hospital at the Reno-Benteen defense site and was under constant fire from the Sioux and Cheyenne riflemen. It is to Dr. Porter's credit that the great majority of the wounded that came under his care survived. So it was only just a few months after the Little Bighorn in September of 1876 when Dr. Porter's contract was up with the U.S. Army, and he left Fort Abraham Lincoln and returned to a medical practice of his own in Bismarck, North Dakota Territory, which is where he would have then been the family doctor for Mr. Neal and his brothers and sisters. So apparently, it sure looks like our Dr. Porter is not only very involved in the Battle of Little Bighorn, he was there, is considered a hero of that particular fight, and really unquestionable character according to the folks that were around him. So for the second question, was there a Colt revolver that would have been distributed at the time, this is 1876, to be tested by trusted members of the United States Army, and hoping that those testimonials would come back positive for the Colt's company? And that had been done multiple times before in the firearm industry. If you look at old catalogs of the Henry rifle and even Spencer and some of the firearms offered during the Civil War, you would see that there are quite a few testimonials from military people on the effectiveness of a particular rifle, and those are quoted then in the catalogs. And so this is likely that the Colt's company was definitely looking for another testimonial like that from really the only active campaign going on right then within the United States. So what in the world, what would have been offered in 1876 that's going to be this experimental gun that they're testing, and particularly in .41 caliber? And so that's a real good clue, because not a whole lot of guns came out in .41 caliber, at least not a combat gun. And the .41 rimfire had been around for quite a while. It was not very stout. It was a Derringer round more than anything. But what was the .41 that had any power compared to that .41 rimfire? Well, if you look at .41 caliber guns, it's the Colt model 1877, and very clever marketer put that out as the, if it was in .38 caliber, as the Colt Lightning, 1877 Lightning, and if it was in .41 caliber, it came out as the Colt Thunderer. And so that's a gun that was put on the market in 1877, which would have been a year after this test period in the Little Bighorn. Well, the .41 central fire came out with the 1877 model Colt double action, and so there hadn't been a previous .41 caliber of a lot of power. But when you look back at the rimfire .41s, there's a tendency there to have a very, very pointed bullet. And so I'm going to throw a bullet up on the screen, and this is a .41 rimfire short. It was introduced in 1863 as a Derringer round. So I think this substantiates the idea that a gun could have been tested by Colts, could have been sent out to military folks, and really the only campaign going. .41 caliber. The pointy bullet could very likely be a kind of a holdover from that .41 rimfire, since they hadn't put either the gun or the cartridge on the market yet. And so there's a potential that that pointy bullet was just a leftover from that .41 rimfire. So that's kind of a jump a little bit. Or it could have been designed with a pointed bullet. I've seen some .41 longs. Most of them are more round nose, but the ammunition provided to Dr. Porter and to the others that got one of these guns, General Terry and Custer, had pointed bullets. And we see a history of pointed bullets back in the rimfire era, which continued on for a while, but in that rimfire cartridge. So we've got a little bit of a substantiation here of both the firearm and the caliber and the bullet that Dr. Porter had described. So my third question was, what would be the tendency of a United States military person to take their own life in a battle with Sioux and Cheyenne or any other tribe across the United States? And just checked a few sources and came up with an idea that very likely could have happened. So I'm going to start. I'm sure there's probably a lot of different cases, but I'm going to start in the same area of the world and take a look at the Fetterman Massacre that took place right outside of Fort Phil Kearny on December 21st, 1866. And this is when Captain Fetterman led a troop of 82 military men, U.S. Army, followed Crazy Horse and some other folks who had lured them into an ambush, and then were completely killed down to the last man. And this was only just a decade before the Little Bighorn itself, and was the biggest military catastrophe in the Indian Wars until the Little Bighorn happened, and then that one kind of took precedent in the top line, and then the Fetterman Massacre was a little bit forgotten, but it was a huge news deal to the rest of the country as Fetterman was massacred. So Fetterman left Fort Phil Kearny with a good portion of the troops, left Colonel Carrington back at the fort in command as he was, and really short-handed. And so Carrington was a little worried that he wouldn't be able to hold Fort Phil Kearny if the Indians attacked, and there's a big band of Sioux that if they attacked, they may not be able to hold the fort. And so he gave out the order that he wanted everyone to run into the powder magazine building. And when the worst came to worst and they were going to be overrun, he ordered that if that was the case, that they would touch off the powder and blow everybody up. So here's a colonel of the United States Army willing to blow up women, children, soldiers, every man there, woman, child left in the fort, rather than having them be captured by the Sioux or Cheyenne. So that would lead you to believe that being captured was an extreme fear. Fort Phil Kearny was under attack by Lakota Sioux mostly, dozens of times every year. And one of the more dangerous things you could be assigned to would be to escort some civilians out to either cut wood for firewood for the winter or for lumber, and also to go out and cut hay in the summer to feed the livestock throughout the winter, horses and livestock inside the fort. And those folks got attacked a lot, and the Army was relatively used to it, put a force out there to protect those haying and wood chopping crews. And like it happened before, a large group of Sioux, Lakota Sioux, attacked one of these crews, and the crew was able to make it, 26 soldiers and 6 civilians, were able to make it in an area they had established with wagon boxes and had dirt barricades and things put up there to protect them as they were fighting the Sioux for their lives. But as they began to defend themselves against this group of warriors, they became very concerned because there was 32 of them, and the estimations vary, but 300 Lakota Sioux warriors is kind of the minimum. Some even say 1,000, which is a little bit hard to believe, but 300 anyway. So it was 10-to-1 odds. There's records of this wagon box fight in the book The Bloody Bozeman, and the author includes journal entries from the soldiers that were there. And many of them said that they had taken the laces out of their shoes, put a loop in one end, and put the other end around the toe of their shoe, and the loop they made in the first end would go around the trigger of their rifle. And if worse came to worse, this would allow them to be able to take their own life with that long-barreled rifle by using that shoelace tied around the trigger and then stepping on it with their boot. Now these are folks that never had to do that. They ended up breaking that wave because they were better armed this time around, that wave of Lakota Sioux coming at them. And many of them survived. I think there were seven killed in that particular battle. None of them committed suicide, but they were prepared to do it. So there's another indication as well. So jumping back forward to the Battle of Little Bighorn, there are reports from the Sioux and the Cheyenne that soldiers actually had killed themselves there on the battlefield. And much to their surprise, as they reported to Army investigators as well as journalists, that at times they were thinking, this person is going to get away from us and we're trying to close the gap. But instead, this person, then escaping, this person pulls out their pistol and shot themselves and fell off their horse. The Sioux and Cheyenne were astonished by that. One of them, they said, had a very, very fast horse. We were not going to be able to catch him, and yet he went through some rough area that slowed his horse down, got spooked, pulled out his pistol, and shot himself. Now, a lot of that was disregarded by the military and disregarded by the journalists as well. And one thing that Dr. Porter had said according to Neil, Bigelow Neil, was that he didn't want any of this information getting out until Libby Custer had passed away. And Libby Custer was well respected by other Army wives, by generals, by a lot of people. She apparently had a reputation of being a very classy person. And she did spend the rest of her life trying to resurrect the reputation of her husband who died there and a lot of times got blamed for the massacre. And so it could be very true that people did not want to embarrass Libby Custer. It's also true that people did not want to embarrass the United States. It was 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. It was our centennial year, and having soldiers kill themselves in battle rather than fight the enemy was something you just didn't want to put out in public. But knowing that the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors had claimed to have seen soldiers take their own life during the battle, and also knowing that the government would have very much liked to have not let this get out to diminish the reputation of our military forces, it starts to lead you to believe that it could have very well happened. And just because Native American testimony was dismissed doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so it's with the example of Colonel Carrington wanting to blow up any survivors, and the folks at the wagon box fight putting the shoelace over the trigger, and Sioux and Cheyenne warriors seeing soldiers take their own life. Taking your own life in battle rather than being caught or captured by the Native American tribes appears to be a likely scenario. So did Custer take his own life at the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the Battle of the Greasy Grass, as our Native Americans would call it? Well, Dr. Porter was a very credible person, known as a very honorable man by two different generals, actually written up by the first general in the Apache Wars as being very, very honorable, well respected in his community, did serve, and was one of the first people to find Custer dead from going from Reno's Hill over to where the Custer's last stand was. So I'd say we have a pretty credible source with Dr. Porter. And then looking further, what kind of a experimental gun was out there and what kind of a pointy bullet that it used in .41 caliber. Well, it would have been what became known as the Model 1877 Colt double-action revolver, and the .41 caliber was called the Thunderer by some clever marketing folks, and the .38 caliber was called the Lightning. So we've got a gun, we've got a cartridge, and we have a history of pointy bullets, and so that adds up. And then we took a look at the likelihood that soldiers would actually take their own life on the battlefield, and we have seen that Colonel Carrington was ready to blow up any survivors after the Fetterman Massacre. The wagon box folks were prepared to shoot themselves by tying a string around their foot and the other end around the trigger. We know that there were eyewitnesses from Lakota Sioux as well as the Cheyenne at the Little Bighorns who said they witnessed soldiers taking their own life. So it all kind of adds up. And did Custer kill himself at the Little Bighorn? We still don't really know. But when you add up the facts, it really makes you think about it, that very possibly in the very end of this battle, where you knew as that last group of soldiers and the swarming group of Sioux and Cheyenne, you knew that there was no way out. And you also knew what had happened to others who may have been captured. There is a likelihood at that point in desperation that you could very likely make that choice. Did it happen? It's hard to say. But I will say that the evidence from Dr. Porter and from Bigelow Neal, who wrote in about his experiences talking with Dr. Porter, does add up, and it definitely makes you wonder. So once again, I appreciate your attention for this video, and if you like the video, hit that thumbs up button and also hit subscribe. Love to have you subscribe. And again, for this edition, I just want to thank you all for coming. Now, General Crook cited Porter for General Crook had cited Porter for conspicuously. General Crook had cited Porter for conspicuous gallantry. Conspicuous. General Crook at the time cited Porter for conspicuous gallantry in the closing campaign against the Tonto Apaches in February and March in 1873.